I like it so much that it's harder for me to do now that I may be older. Everyone thought that the Hackman family would grieve in private, maybe make a short comment, and then go away from the public eye. What happened next, though, was unbelievable. It was like a major scandal as rumors turned into accusations, and then a shocking discovery in court that changed everything. Come with us as we find out what Gene Hackman's son said in court that shocked everyone. Christopher's admission about his father's death. Reports say Christopher said his father's death could have been caused by a gas leak. Even though it sounds impossible, there were different ways to look at what he said. At first, Christopher's story about what happened to his father made sense. Gene's house was old and tucked away in a cute but old part of Santa Fe that is known for its classic architecture and old-fashioned infrastructure. It was possible that there was a gas leak. His words, however, did more than just make people worry about the building's safety. They caused a chain of questions that no one saw coming. As well, it made people wonder why he brought up a gas leak right now. The more important question is, what did he really mean? It wasn't long before reporters started looking into it, and what they found broke the perfect picture of a loving father and son. Instead, a web of paradoxes came into being, buried secrets and problems that go back decades. Christopher Hackman was always a strange person. He was born into Hollywood royalty, but most people don't see him. He never tried to be famous or get attention like other famous kids did. Many years ago, that was seen as a sign of modesty or quiet respect for his father's work. But now people are asking different questions. Why did he keep quiet? Was it out of respect, or was it the start of something deeper and more complicated? There was a big change in the story less than 4 months after Gene Hackman died. The courtroom doors opened. It wasn't just about how Gene had died anymore. I like to think of myself as a craftsman, and as a craftsman, you have to do certain things.
Yeah.
It was now time to talk about what Christopher did in the months and weeks before his father died. This new information about what he did before his father died sounds a little fishy. Do you want to know why? Stay tuned, because we're about to reveal some shocking facts
Moment.
relating to Gene's death. How Christopher hides his moves. Over time, claims came out that he had tried to change his father's will. There were rumors that he lied to people about Gene's health. And what was most shocking was that Christopher himself admitted he hadn't been honest. The case quickly grew into something bigger than a family fight. It caused people all over the country to talk about loyalty, inheritance, and the thin line between lying and protecting someone. For many people, Gene Hackman was more than just an actor, a man who quit Hollywood on his own terms, choosing solitude over fame. But after he died, his carefully kept silence was drowned out by rumors and debates that never stopped. The prosecutor's main points of contention were the last 6 months of Gene Hackman's life. People said that Christopher had been planning changes to his father's land in secret during this time. They showed proof that he had lied when he called lawyers and said his father was mentally ill while secretly taking pictures and sending texts of happy times. They showed emails, notes on the calendar, and cash records that all pointed to a well-thought-out plan. But it wasn't just the hard evidence that made a difference. It was the way they felt, the way things slowly fell apart after what everyone thought was a quiet death. Then there was a moment that made everyone in the courtroom freeze. Christopher told the truth at a very important point in the trial, which changed everything. It took him a long time to say things. He didn't cry right away, but something inside him seemed to change. Christopher Hackman put himself in charge of keeping his father's name alive, even if it meant telling lies. When he spoke in court, people were very upset. In the courtroom, some people couldn't hold back their tears, while others looked away because they didn't know how to feel. Christopher, were you a good son? Do you want to do the right thing? Or was he someone who went after his father's fall for their own gain? There was no clear answer to that question, which made the case even more interesting. The news outlets jumped right into the emotional twist. Different news stories said different things about Christopher. Some said he was a sad son, while others said he was lying. At one point, he was seen as a guy who had to make a hard choice. The next day, he was charged with treason. The public had very different opinions. Christopher wasn't charged with a crime when the verdict came in, but his image would never be the same. For every person who felt sorry for him, there was someone else who was upset. There was more to this case than just the fact that it involved a famous star, or that it went very badly in court. It brought up deeper, more personal problems that seeing a loved one die brought to light, trying to keep their pride while dealing with the painful truth of their fall, and having to make the impossible choice between telling the truth and being loyal. A lot of people related to Christopher's story, even though they didn't agree with all of his decisions. But this was just the start. What began as a personal family disaster became a national conversation that was talked about in courtrooms, broken down in homes, and analyzed in documentaries and news stories. On the other hand, Christopher Hackman was famous for one thing before all of this. He was the son of a famous Hollywood actor. Christopher had a famous last name, but he had never used it to his advantage. He never did interviews about his dad, stopped by talk shows to talk about Gene's success, or tried to make money off of Hollywood memories. In fact, he seemed to do everything he could to stay out of the lights. It made a lot of people admire him. It was different from other famous kids because he wasn't trying to be famous or get respect, but these quiet traits would hurt him in the years to come. Once seen as humble, his quiet would start to look like he was keeping something from them. Is he really being honest though, or is it all a show?
Well, let's find out.
Christopher as a child. In 1960, Christopher joined Gene's story. At that time, Gene Hackman was still having trouble getting big jobs. At that point, Christopher grew up in a world where nothing was certain. No awards or fame had been won by his father yet. The Hackman family led a simple life, moving from small flats in New York to ones in Los Angeles. Like many families trying to get ahead, they had to deal with stress about money, long work hours, and the difficulties of managing work and family life. Christopher was a youngster when Gene's fame really took off in the 1970s. His father was no longer just an actor. He was a superstar, and not just any famous person. People knew him for taking on big parts and playing complicated characters that made people speechless. But progress came with a long way to go. As Gene's fame grew, he seemed to spend less time with his son. Christopher's friends from youth said he was a quiet, artistic boy who kept to himself. He never talked badly about his dad or brought friends to film sets, and he didn't seem to like the attention that came with his last name. That being said, there were no public incidents or bad feelings. Christopher did not break the rules with his dad. He did not write an autobiography or do exciting interviews for tabloids. He didn't get into any trouble. He learned how to work the camera and edit movies while working behind the scenes in Hollywood for a while, but he eventually quit the business. He was sometimes seen at film events or industry gatherings, but he was always in the background and never tried to get attention. This choice to keep things private made a strong impression. As everyone knows, there are some famous sons who could have used their fame to make money. He didn't do that for Christopher though, a son who, unlike many children of famous people, wasn't interested in the cool stuff that comes with being famous. People respected him because of it until one day it stopped. Gene Hackman and his son were rarely seen together in public during the last few years of his life. It was after he had retired and was living a quiet life in New Mexico, away from the chaos of Hollywood. Some people thought that the distance between them meant that their relationship was over, but people who knew the family better told a different story. Christopher was always there behind the scenes. He set up trips to the doctor, kept schedules, and did anything else his dad needed. Christopher did everything he could to keep Gene from being seen by the public as his memory got worse. But in the end, that careful protection was what raised the controversy. Did Christopher do what he did out of love, or was he manipulating the situation for his own gain? That was the question that divided a nation and made people truly worried. Christopher and his father had always been seen together in natural moments, never staged, always real. They were captured in quiet walks under the warm sun or browsing through bookshelves, speaking volumes without ever saying a word. People admired their relationship, believing it was built on love and loyalty. Christopher was seen as the ideal son, reserved, dependable, and completely unaffected by the chaos of Hollywood fame. While many celebrity families were known for their scandals, he stood apart, earning respect for keeping his father's private life exactly that as private as he wished. But when accusations against him surfaced, they shocked everyone. No one expected him to be at the center of a scandal, especially not the same son, who had so carefully guarded his father's reputation. In the beginning, there were no signs of anything unusual, but after his father's passing, Christopher appeared calm and composed, thanking well-wishers for their support and asking for privacy as the family grieved. It didn't end there. He went ahead to honor an interview, and it was this interview that revealed everything. That one statement. While speaking to a local reporter, Christopher made an unexpected comment. He casually suggested that a gas leak might have led to his father's death. It was a statement that quickly raised eyebrows. Why bring up something so important without solid proof? Why hint at an environmental factor when no official reports had addressed it? Was this a slip of the tongue from a grieving son, Or was there something more to it? The people didn't know what to think, but the authorities took notice. As investigators looked deeper into the final weeks of his father's life, unsettling facts began to emerge. Medical records showed inconsistencies. There were financial deals that raised questions. Emails emerged, portraying his father as more aware and involved than Christopher had previously claimed. Suddenly, the quiet and humble son was under intense investigation. Every statement, picture, and action from the past were carefully looked over again. Was he really looking out for his dad's legacy, or was he trying to change the last chapter so it fit his needs? The news outlets that used to be afraid to criticize the son of a famous person were now paying full attention to the drama. Experts disagreed on what adult children should do when they are taking care of elderly parents. The emotional weight of seeing a loved one die was talked about by psychologists. Christopher was in the middle of it all, no longer in the background, but now the center of attention. People they knew, like friends and family, started sharing their own accounts. Some people saw Christopher as a loving son, who had always had a hard time living in the shadow of his famous father, but really wanted to keep his privacy. Some people had a different view. They thought Christopher had such tight control over his father that not even old friends could get to him. Was he guarding his father's peace, or was he keeping secrets? With the trial coming up, it became clear that the case wasn't about whether Christopher loved his father or not. That was already clear. The real question was whether he was telling the truth. The picture of the perfect, respectful son that had been carefully kept up for decades was now being looked at as proof. His acts were no longer just his own choices. They were now public concerns. There were tough questions. Why did he say in court papers that his father was mentally unfit when he had shared happy pictures of the two of them together just weeks before? Why has there been sudden suspicious behavior in financial accounts? Why was an attempt made to change his father's will right after an episode of serious disorientation? Christopher's answers in court were complicated. He spoke of the stress of managing his father's declining health, the emotional weight of trying to keep the family together, and the desire to protect his father's public image as strong and in control. He admitted to leaving out certain details, but claimed he never meant to do anything wrong. Some believed him, whereas others didn't. His story didn't fit easily into the box of hero or villain. Yes, he loved his father. Yes, he fought with the pain of seeing him decline. But love doesn't always prevent bad choices, and pain doesn't always justify them. The public's view of Christopher changed. He was no longer just the golden kid. His story got more difficult and real. People saw themselves in him when they saw how hard it was to deal with family and pressure, with the stress of doing what they thought was right. It was more than just a scandal. When he fell from grace, it was a deep reflection of how truth and perception don't always match up, and how even the best goals can have terrible results. As the next part of the trial began, Christopher's carefully created image was about to fall apart piece by piece. The death of Hackman was met with the quiet respect that befits a Hollywood celebrity at first. He was 95 years old and no longer in the public eye. He chose to spend his last years in Santa Fe, New Mexico, because of its peaceful scenery. Family, friends, and local officials both confirmed that he had died, and no one thought to question it. After all, 95 is an age when most people die. People gave him somber nods and said he had lived a full life and moved on. It didn't last though. Christopher's words, which he said only 2 days after his father died, broke it. In an interview with a newspaper from a small town, he said that he thought a gas leak might have been the cause of his father's health problems. In the weeks before his death, he even talked about strange smells in the house and strange things his father did. People were shocked by the reporter's lack of interest in the story, which could have been out of respect. The internet picked up the idea and ran with it. Within a day, entertainment blogs began to wonder why there were no accounts of carbon monoxide. After 48 hours, the story was picked up by big news outlets. There were headlines that were cautious about the news, and headlines that were much more striking. At first it looked like a simple mistake, or maybe just a son who was upset trying to figure out what was going on. But as people put pressure on local leaders to give answers, the story began to fall apart. There were no reports of a gas leak before or after Hackman's death. There were also no calls for help, visits from the fire department, or most importantly, an autopsy. Finished quietly, a week after he died, and didn't say anything strange. Brain problems caused by Alzheimer's were the cause of death. Environmental issues were not talked about. So why did Christopher say something different? That was the question that nobody knew the answer to. How people reacted. Some close to the family began to talk. Some people said Hackman had been very clear in their last talks. Others remembered times when he seemed lost or confused. Even weeks before he died, a former friend brought up a strange event. Two of their dogs were seen walking around the streets, looking like they were lost. When asked if the neighbor thought the gas leak might have caused this, they just said they didn't think so. But people who had been in the house were the ones who were really worried. According to an anonymous nurse who looked for Hackman in his last days, the actor was still able to talk 3 days before he died. Another caregiver said he had times of clarity and kept doing small things around the house. Chris had told everyone a story that didn't match this. He had drawn a picture of a man who was weakening, unable, barely aware. Others, though, talked about a man who, despite being sick, still had times when he was strong and in charge. There were more and more inconsistencies. Christopher always told other people that his dad had lost his mind. It was said in a message to a friend that his father hadn't seen him in months. That message was later used as important proof in the case. People didn't believe him at first, but as the probe went on, things didn't make sense. When medical papers were looked over, they showed a different picture. There were more questions as more people learned about the story. As a result, reporters began to look for the truth by requesting official medical records, comments, and anything else that could help make things clear. Then a shocking detail was found that no one had expected. Hidden in the personal notes of a nurse, the nurse had written down a talk that completely contradicted Christopher's claims just 2 weeks before Hackman died. The story says that Hackman had been talking about deep issues, such as a rare personality disorder, the effects of past trauma, and even how emotional problems he had in his teens had affected his life now. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had forgotten about the real world. It was even said that they used to be dependent on sedatives, which had never been brought up before. When this news came out, it made people wonder if Christopher was giving the whole truth, or was he making up a story about what happened that fit his needs, just to make things more interesting. Christopher's comments were not the end of the case. It went further than that, and turned huge drama. So stay tuned for some juicy juice. The drama in court. You would notice that Gene was very careful if you knew him well. It was something he had carefully planned, even when he was retired. Reports in his study said that there was a box with the name actor. Was it something new to try? You had to go and try to get that job. And having letters, notes, and clear directions on how he wanted to be remembered written by hand. He wanted private for more than one reason. One was to keep his public image safe. It included everything about his personal life. He had very clear wishes for his funeral. He named the causes he had helped for a long time, and even picked out the music he wanted to be played. Everyone was shocked by what happened after he died because he had planned everything so well. Reports say that his original will, which was filed with the government and last changed 15 years before he died, was very clear. It included large gifts to charities, a trust fund for his grandkids and close friends, and a structure that was carefully thought out to keep any one person from having too much control over his estate. Christopher, his only son, was named as the beneficiary and agent, but without giving him too much power. He was only given a few tasks to do. People became suspicious right away when Christopher showed them an updated will that had been signed only 50 weeks before Gene's death. The new paper had been properly signed and notarized. Neither witness was a client of the law company Christopher hired earlier that year, though. There were big changes to the will. Donations worth almost $2 million had been taken away, along with a note saying that the promises had already been kept. Christopher's inheritance had grown even more, and new terms gave him a lot more control over his father's books, film rights, and intellectual property. There were still trust funds for the grandkids, but the rules were loosened, cutting down on the amount of oversight. But the most disturbing change was one that was small, but very important. When Gene's mental health got worse, there was a special language in the original will that stopped anyone from changing the document. That clause was taken out now. It was a carefully written safety measure, meant to stop any manipulation if Gene started to lose his mind. The fact that it wasn't there brought up important moral and legal issues. Had Gene really meant to change his mind in such a big way? Or had someone taken advantage of the fact that he was weak in his last year? When the case went to trial, these questions were at the center of the discussion. Was Christopher just doing what his dad told him to do? Or was there something much worse going on? There were many layers of legal arguments, medical reports, and conflicting statements that covered up the truth. As the fight in court went on, people around the world watched to see if justice would be done, or if the history of yet another family would be ruined by uncertainty and controversy. Christopher said that his father really wanted the changes to be made to the will. He stood in front of the judge and said Gene had made these choices on his own. Christopher says that his dad was wary of some charity groups and worried about what would happen to the work he had done all his life after he died. Some people didn't believe him when he said he wanted things to be clear and simple. The people who were prosecuting the case saw something much worse. The people there thought Christopher had taken advantage of Gene's weakness at that time. The will wasn't illegal in and of itself. It had been signed and approved by the right people. On paper, everything looked good. What was important wasn't documents, though. Before Gene made these choices, he thought about the people involved at the time and his own health. His medical papers told a lot of different things. His doctors said that he seemed confused or had trouble remembering things from time to time. Others said there were times when he was fully awake and able to think clearly. A test done a few weeks before Gene's death showed that his memory wasn't great, but it wasn't completely bad either. This uncertainty made the case even more difficult. The prosecutors built their argument around three key points: access, contradictions, and motivation. First, they pointed out that Christopher had taken control of nearly every aspect of his father's life in his final year. He scheduled Gene's appointments, controlled who could see him, and managed all legal issues. Second, they showed how Christopher's claims about his father's health didn't add up. To doctors, he said Gene was declining quickly, but at the same time, he talked to his father about book projects and home improvements. Finally, they presented a strong reason why Christopher might have done all this. Possibly because he stood to gain more money and more power, especially since there had been long-standing tensions between him and other family members. One of the most powerful pieces of proof came in the form of an audio recording. A family friend had recorded a chat that Gene had just a few months before he died. Gene was heard talking about his will on the tape. He said he had written it years ago and didn't want to change it. Then, just as he was ending his thought, Christopher interrupted and told the friend to stop recording. The defense claimed that this recording wasn't legally important, it was just casual. They thought it showed what Gene really wanted, though. What was more important was that it showed a difference between what Gene thought happened and what really happened. The person who might have been the most surprising wasn't someone from the outside. The person who signed the will was a lawyer. She said that even though Gene seemed to know what he signed, she hadn't been told that he had Alzheimer's. She didn't say right away when asked if she would have done something different if she had known. The courtroom was tense during that pause. Christopher, on the other hand, kept quiet for most of the hearing. He sat there with his palms together and a serious look on his face. He only looked up to read emails or papers. He never spoke up. He didn't say anything. But the mood in the courtroom got more tense every time a message or video of his voice played. An old text message from Christopher was read out loud, which was one of the tense times. The message was sent just a few days after the will was changed, and based on the message, the defense said he was just finishing up some court paperwork, but the lawyer said it wasn't clear how it was written. It didn't sound like an email. It sounded like someone had gotten past the last thing that was stopping them. It wasn't just about money in this case. Trust, family, and following someone's last wishes were all important parts of the story. There wasn't a single clear act of wrongdoing that stood out as each part of the will was looked at. Instead, there was a pattern of small, careful choices. The case caused heated arguments outside of court. Some people thought it should have stayed between the family and never been made public. Others thought it was an important case because it showed how older people can be forced to change their wills. News stations asked experts to talk about the morality of wills and estate planning. Talk shows talked about how normal it was for family members to change the wills of their elderly relatives. In fact, one well-known writer called the case heartbreaking. But when I was in court, it felt a lot more personal. It wasn't just papers for court.
It had to do with whether Gene's last wishes had been carried out, or whether his memory had been changed by someone else. After weeks of close study, every word in the will had been examined. Every signature, date and change had been taken apart and looked at carefully. The court wasn't there to pick a good or bad kid. That wasn't their job to test love or loyalty. Their job was easy. Check to see if the will had been legally and freely altered. The emotional part of the case, whether Christopher had broken his father's trust, was up to everyone to decide. The courthouse was packed on the last day of speeches. It was something Santa Fe had never seen before. There were reporters on the streets, podcasters who talked about true crimes, whispered into their mics. Gene fans held up old movie pictures as if he were going to come back in some way. What started out as a private court case became a show for the whole country. There was a lot of tension in the hall. Press members, lawyers, witnesses, and family members sat in every spot. A few photographers whispering to each other. Photographers were whispering to each other. Photographers changed how their equipment worked. But when Christopher walked into the room, everything changed. He looked shorter than the tall man the media had made him out to be. When he was dressed in a dark suit, his face looked worn out. His facial emotions were hard to read, because he mostly avoided looking at the people in the room and went straight to his place. This wasn't the same man who had been sure of himself in interviews. His life was now being watched by everyone. If you liked this video, please click the next button and share it with your friends.